1 year later, the Richardson estate's garden bloomed with white roses and lilies. The same place where Rose once faced humiliation was now transformed for a celebration of love. She stood in the bridal suite, her mother adjusting her veil with trembling hands. "I never dreamed this day would come," her mother whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "My little girl, about to change the world." The past year had been a whirlwind of changes. After their public stand together, Rose and Mr. Richardson had faced both criticism and support. But something unexpected happened. Their story sparked a national conversation about love, class, and prejudice. Alexandra appeared in the doorway, beaming. "The Foundation's new scholarship program has already received thousands of applications," she announced. "Your idea to help underprivileged students is changing lives." Rose smiled, remembering how she and Mr. Richardson had thrown themselves into establishing the foundation properly after their engagement. They turned the media attention into a force for good, using their platform to create real change. "Is Mother coming?" Rose asked softly. Alexandra's expression softened. "She's already seated in the front row. It took time, but seeing how happy you make her son, well, even the strongest prejudices can't stand against true love." Mrs. Chen knocked on the door, her usual stern expression replaced with a gentle smile. "It's time," she said, holding out a bouquet of white roses. As Rose walked down the aisle, she saw faces that told the story of her journey. Her family, beaming with pride. The household staff, who had become true friends. Even Olivia was there, having found her own happiness after accepting that some things weren't meant to be. Mr. Richardson waited at the altar, his eyes filled with love and wonder. As she reached him, he whispered, "You changed everything." "We changed everything," she corrected softly. The ceremony was beautiful, but it was the reception that truly showed how far they'd come. Guests from all walks of life mingled together. Business tycoons chatting with Rose's childhood friends, socialites dancing with household staff. During the speeches, Alexandra raised her glass. "A year ago, this garden witnessed an act of cruelty. Today, it witnesses the triumph of love over prejudice. My brother and Rose didn't just find each other, they showed us all a better way to live." Later, as they shared their first dance, Mr. Richardson held Rose close. "Remember when you tried to resign?" he teased. "Remember when your mother said she'd rather lose a son than see you marry the help?" She countered with a smile. He laughed. "And now she's showing everyone pictures of our foundation's work, proud as can be." "People can change," Rose said softly, "when love shows them how." As the evening wound down, the newlyweds snuck away to the garden where their story began. The same fountain that once witnessed Rose's humiliation now reflected the stars above them. "What are you thinking?" he asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About all the other Roses out there," she replied. "The ones who think they're not good enough, who believe love has limits." He squeezed her hand. "That's why our work is just beginning. The foundation, the scholarships, the mentoring programs will show them that dreams don't have to follow society's rules. And we'll do it together," she added, leaning into his embrace. From inside, they could hear the celebration continuing, a perfect blend of both their worlds, no longer separated by invisible barriers. As they walked back to their guests, Rose thought about how far they'd come. From maid to wife, from outcast to inspiration, from hiding their love to celebrating it proudly. But more importantly, they'd created something bigger than themselves, hope for others who dared to love across society's boundaries. The Richardson estate, once a symbol of rigid social hierarchy, had become a beacon of change. And as Rose and her husband danced under the stars, they knew their story would continue inspiring others to believe in the power of love to transform not just two lives, but an entire society. Their happily ever after wasn't just about them, it was about proving that true love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that break all the rules. The week after Rose's departure from the Richardson estate felt like the longest of her life. She threw herself into caring for her family, trying to ignore the ache in her heart. But everywhere she went, whispers followed. "Did you hear about the maid who almost broke up the Richardson family? I heard she was after their money all along. Can you believe she thought she could marry into that family?" The local newspaper had somehow gotten hold of the story, painting her as either a gold digger or a victim, depending on which day's edition you read. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from unknown numbers, some supportive, others filled with hate. One morning, as she helped her mother with breakfast, they saw a news van parked outside their modest home. "You don't have to hide," her mother said softly. "You've done nothing wrong." "Haven't I?" Rose sighed, peeking through the curtains. "I fell in love with someone I shouldn't have. I caused so much trouble for everyone." "Love doesn't follow rules," her mother replied, squeezing her hand. "And from what you've told me, that young man loves you too." Just then, Rose's phone lit up with Alexandra's number. She'd been avoiding her calls, but this time something made her answer. "Rose, you need to see this." Alexandra's voice was urgent. "Turn on the morning news." With shaking hands, Rose switched on the TV. There on screen was Mr. Richardson standing at a press conference. "I want to address the rumors surrounding my family," he was saying, his voice steady. "Yes, I ended my engagement. Yes, I fell in love with someone who worked in our household. And no, I'm not ashamed of either fact." The reporters erupted with questions, but he continued. "The woman you've been slandering is one of the most intelligent, compassionate people I've ever met. She graduated top of her class while working multiple jobs to support her family. She's transformed our family's foundation with her innovative ideas. And she left not because of scandal, but because she cared more about protecting my family relationships than her own happiness." Rose watched, tears streaming down her face as he looked directly into the camera. "To those who think love should be limited by social class or background, you're part of what's wrong with our society. And to Rose, I respect your need for space, but know that I'm not giving up on us." The phone rang again. This time it was a major magazine wanting her side of the story. Then another call and another. Rose turned off her phone, overwhelmed. "What should I do?" she asked her mother. "What does your heart tell you?" Before she could answer, there was a knock at their door. Rose opened it to find Alexandra standing there. "Your brother," Rose started, "is being incredibly brave," Alexandra finished. "And now it's your turn." "Our mother is furious. Olivia's family is threatening lawsuits, and half of our social circle is scandalized. But you know what? We've never been happier." "How can that be?" "Because for the first time, we're living honestly. Mother's prejudices, the social expectations, they've controlled us for too long. You showed us there's another way." Just then, they heard commotion outside. More reporters had arrived, along with a crowd of onlookers. Some held signs supporting Rose, others condemning her. "I never wanted this attention," Rose whispered. "Sometimes the greatest love stories become public property," Alexandra said gently. "The question is, are you willing to fight for your happiness, even with the whole world watching?" Rose thought about Mr. Richardson's words at the press conference, about her mother's wisdom, about all the young people who might be inspired to follow their hearts if she stood her ground. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto her front porch. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, but Rose held her head high. "I have something to say," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Love doesn't see color, class, or bank accounts. It sees the heart. And if my story helps even one person believe that they deserve love regardless of their background, then all this scrutiny will be worth it." As she spoke, a familiar car pulled up. Mr. Richardson stepped out, walking through the crowd to stand beside her. "Ready to face this together?" he asked quietly. Rose looked at him, then at the cameras, then at her mother and Alexandra standing proudly in the doorway. "Yes," she replied, taking his hand. "I'm done running from happiness." The headlines the next day would be explosive, but for the first time, Rose didn't care. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is choosing love, even when the whole world is watching. The autumn breeze rustled through the Richardson Estates gardens as Rose sat in her small office, surrounded by foundation proposals. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of changes, but today felt different. The tension in the house had reached a breaking point. That morning, she'd overheard Mr. Richardson arguing with his mother in the study. "She's not suitable for this family," his mother's voice had carried through the door. "First you let her work on the foundation, and now I hear rumors about you two becoming close. Think about your position, about Olivia." Rose's hands shook as she gathered her papers. The weight of everything, the whispers, the stares, the increasing hostility from certain family members, suddenly felt overwhelming. Mrs. Chen appeared in her doorway, her expression unusually serious. "The family is requesting your presence in the main sitting room. Now." Rose's heart pounded as she walked down the hallway. Inside the sitting room, she found Mr. Richardson's mother, Alexandra, and Olivia waiting. Mr. Richardson himself was notably absent. "We need to discuss your position here," his mother began, her voice cold. "Your presence has become disruptive." "Mother," Alexandra warned, but the older woman continued. "You've overstepped your boundaries, getting involved in family business, spending time alone with my son. It's clear you have ulterior motives." Olivia smirked from her position by the window. "We all know what she's after." Rose stood straighter, finding strength in her dignity. "With all due respect, I've done nothing wrong. I've performed my duties professionally and—" "Your duties?" Olivia laughed sharply. "Is that what you call trying to seduce your employer?" "That's enough." Mr. Richardson's voice thundered from the doorway. Everyone turned to see him standing there, his face flushed with anger. "James, darling," Olivia started, but he cut her off. "I've heard enough. Mother, I've respected your opinions my entire life, but not this time. Rose has shown more integrity, intelligence, and genuine care for this family than anyone else in this room." His mother gasped. "How dare you?" "None, how dare you," he countered. "You've treated her terribly from day one, not because of anything she's done, but because of your own prejudices." Rose felt tears threatening to fall. "Mr. Richardson, please. I should go." "No," he said softly, moving to stand beside her. "I'm done pretending. Mother, Olivia, I ended my engagement last week. I'd fallen in love with Rose." The room erupted in chaos. Olivia stormed out, his mother began berating him, and Alexandra tried to maintain order. Rose slipped away in the confusion, rushing to gather her things. She couldn't be the reason for this family falling apart. As she packed her desk, tears finally spilling over, Alexandra found her. "Running away isn't the answer," she said gently. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Rose whispered. "I just wanted to do my job, to make a difference." "And you have," Alexandra assured her. "My brother is happier than I've ever seen him. Our foundation is flourishing under your guidance. Don't let their prejudices win." But Rose had made up her mind. She wrote a quick resignation letter, her tears staining the paper. As she headed for the door, Mr. Richardson caught up with her in the garden. "Please don't go," he pleaded, catching her hand. "Your family will never accept me," she said softly. "I won't be the reason you lose them." "They'll come around or they won't," he replied firmly. "But I lost my way long before you came here, living the life they wanted instead of following my heart. You helped me find myself again." Rose looked into his eyes, seeing all the future possibilities there, both beautiful and frightening. "I need time," she whispered. "To think, to be sure this is right." He nodded, understanding in his expression. "Take all the time you need. But know that I'll be here, fighting for us. Because some things are worth fighting for." As Rose walked home that evening, her resignation letter still in her pocket, she realized that sometimes the hardest part of following your heart is believing you deserve happiness. The question wasn't just whether she should stay or go, it was whether she was brave enough to accept that love doesn't care about social boundaries or family expectations. What she didn't know was that her decision would not only change her life, but would transform the Richardson family forever. Sometimes the biggest acts of love require walking away, if only to find the strength to come back stronger. The weeks following the garden party brought subtle but significant changes to Rose's life at the Richardson estate. One quiet afternoon, while organizing files in the study, she found herself alone with Mr. Richardson as he reviewed business documents. "These quarterly reports are giving me a headache," he sighed, rubbing his temples. Rose couldn't help but notice the stress lines around his eyes. "Perhaps I could help," she offered hesitantly. "I did major in business administration." He looked up surprised. "You have a business degree?" "Yes, with a focus on non-profit management. It was my dream to start a foundation helping underprivileged students," she explained, then quickly added, "But of course, that's not my place here." "No, please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'd love to hear your thoughts." For the next hour, they pored over the reports together. Rose pointed out several opportunities for cost reduction and suggested innovative ways to streamline operations. Mr. Richardson listened intently, clearly impressed by her insights. "Why didn't you mention any of this before?" he asked softly. Rose smoothed her apron nervously. "I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to prove myself based on the work I was hired to do." Their conversation was interrupted by Alexandra entering the study. To Rose's surprise, instead of disapproving, Alexandra joined their discussion, particularly interested in Rose's ideas about charitable initiatives. "We've been looking to expand our foundation's reach," Alexandra mentioned. "Would you be interested in helping us develop some new programs?" Before Rose could respond, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door with Mr. Richardson's girlfriend, Olivia. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Darling, what's going on here?" Olivia's voice was sweet, but her eyes were cold as they fixed on Rose. "Just discussing some business matters," Mr. Richardson replied casually. "With the maid?" Olivia's laugh was sharp. "Surely you were joking." Rose began to stand, but Alexandra's voice stopped her. "Rose has a business degree and valuable experience in non-profit management. Her input is quite welcome here." Olivia's perfectly made-up face twisted slightly. "Really? Well, isn't that interesting? Though I must say, it seems rather inappropriate for her to be spending so much time with James." The implication in her tone was clear. Rose felt her cheeks burn as she excused herself, hurrying from the room. Behind her, she could hear the beginning of an argument. Later that evening, as Rose was leaving, Alexandra caught up with her in the garden. "Don't let Olivia bother you," she said firmly. "My brother has been making his own decisions about who to trust and value for years now." Rose shook her head. "Miss Thompson, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to cause problems. Maybe I should just stick to my regular duties." "Absolutely not," Alexandra interrupted. "Your talents are wasted on just housekeeping. Starting tomorrow, I want you to split your time between your current duties and helping with our foundation work. We'll adjust your salary accordingly, of course." Rose's eyes widened. "But what about Mrs. Chen? And the others?" "Let me handle them," Alexandra smiled. "Times are changing, Rose. It's about time this household changed too." That night, as Rose shared the news with her family over dinner, her mother squeezed her hand proudly. "You see? Good things come to those who work hard and stay true to themselves." But even as Rose felt hope rising in her heart, she couldn't forget the look in Mr. Richardson's eyes when they worked together, or the way Olivia had looked at her. She knew this promotion would make her position even more complicated. The next morning, she arrived early to find Mr. Richardson waiting in the foyer. "I wanted to apologize for Olivia's behavior yesterday," he said quietly. "There's no need," Rose replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite the flutter in her chest. "I understand her concerns." "Do you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I don't. I've never cared less about what society expects. What I care about is—" The sound of approaching footsteps cut him off. They quickly stepped apart as Mrs. Chen rounded the corner, but something had changed between them, something that couldn't be undone. As Rose walked to her new office space, she realized she was entering uncharted territory. Her life was transforming in ways she never expected, and she wasn't sure where this path would lead. But one thing was certain: she couldn't go back to being invisible anymore, even if she wanted to. The Richardson estate buzzed with activity as preparations for the annual garden party reached their peak. Rose moved gracefully through the chaos, directing caterers and adjusting flower arrangements with practiced ease. The afternoon sun made the crystal champagne glasses sparkle as she carefully arranged them on pristine white tablecloths. Alexandra had unexpectedly put Rose in charge of coordinating the event, much to Mrs. Chen's visible displeasure. Everything must be perfect, Mrs. Chen had reminded her for the 10th time that morning, hovering nearby like a storm cloud. As guests began arriving in their designer outfits and expensive jewelry, Rose kept to the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She noticed Mr. Richardson watching her from across the garden, but quickly focused back on her duties when his socialite friends surrounded him. "Can you believe they let the hell plan this?" A woman in a red designer dress whispered loudly to her companion. "Standards really have fallen." Rose pretended not to hear as she refreshed the hors d'oeuvres display. She'd learned to let such comments roll off her back, though they still stung. The party was in full swing when it happened. Rose was carrying a tray of champagne when a woman in an ivory silk dress deliberately stepped into her path. Time seemed to slow as the glasses toppled, champagne splashing across the woman's expensive outfit. "You clumsy, worthless girl," the woman shrieked, drawing everyone's attention. "Look what you've done to my dress. It's ruined." The garden fell silent. Rose stood perfectly still, her heart pounding but her expression composed. "And now I notice my diamond bracelet is missing," the woman continued, her voice dripping with accusation. "Empty your pockets immediately." Before Rose could respond, Alexandra's voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough, Victoria." She walked over, her heels clicking against the stone path. "I watched you remove your bracelet in the powder room earlier. It's probably still there." Victoria's face flushed. "Well, she still ruined my dress. She should be fired immediately." "Actually," Mr. Richardson stepped forward, "I saw you intentionally bump into Rose. The security cameras will confirm it." His voice was quiet but firm. "I believe you owe her an apology." Victoria looked around for support, but found none. Even her usual allies were avoiding her gaze. The tables had turned. "I think it's best if you leave," Alexandra suggested coolly. "And Victoria? Don't expect any more invitations to our events." As Victoria stormed out, Alexandra turned to Rose. "Are you all right?" "Yes, ma'am," Rose replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I should clean this up." "Let the cleaning crew handle it," Mr. Richardson interrupted gently. "Please, join us for a drink. You've more than earned it." Whispers erupted around the garden as Mr. Richardson led Rose to the family's private table. Alexandra joined them, shooting warning glances at anyone who dared to stare too long. "I won't pretend this changes everything," Alexandra said quietly to Rose. "Some people will always resist change, but you've shown remarkable grace under pressure, and that's worth more than any pedigree." As the party continued, Rose felt something shift in the atmosphere. Several guests who had previously ignored her now stopped to chat. Mrs. Chen, though still stiff, nodded respectfully when passing by. Later that evening, as Rose gathered her things to leave, Mr. Richardson approached her again. "You handled that situation beautifully," he said, his eyes warm with admiration. "Though I'm sorry you had to experience it at all." "Thank you for defending me," Rose replied softly. "But won't this cause problems for you?" He smiled. "Sometimes doing the right thing means ruffling a few feathers. Besides," he added, his voice taking on a softer tone, "I've learned that true worth isn't about social status or family connections. It's about character." Their eyes met for a moment, and Rose felt her heart skip a beat. But she quickly looked away, reminding herself of the reality of their situations. As she walked home that evening, Rose reflected on how one incident had changed so much. The garden party had started as a potential disaster, but ended up revealing who her true allies were. More importantly, it had shown that sometimes standing your ground with dignity was the best response to prejudice. What she didn't know was that this event would mark a turning point in her story, one that would lead to even bigger changes in the days to come. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air, and this was just the beginning of her journey at the Richardson estate. The early morning light streamed through the mansion's windows as Rose moved efficiently through her daily routine. 2 months had passed since she'd started working at the Richardson estate, and despite the challenges, she'd proven herself invaluable. Rose took pride in going above and beyond her duties. She noticed small details others missed, remembering how each family member liked their rooms arranged, which fresh flowers brought Alexandra joy, and even learning to prepare special tea blends for Mr. Richardson's frequent business meetings. But not everyone appreciated her dedication. Mrs. Chen watched her like a hawk, waiting for any mistake. The other maids, led by a woman named Patricia, often whispered behind her back and accidentally bumped into her while she carried fresh linens or tea trays. One morning, as Rose arranged flowers in the main hall, she overheard Patricia speaking to a group of visiting socialites. "Can you believe Alexandra hired her? The standards of this house have really slipped. My grandmother would never have allowed." Rose's hands trembled slightly, but she continued her work, each stem placed with careful precision. She'd learned long ago that her work would speak louder than any response she could give. Later that day, while organizing Alexandra's study, Rose noticed some financial documents had been misplaced. Without hesitation, she sorted them properly, adding helpful tabs for easy reference. When Alexandra returned from her meeting, she was pleasantly surprised. "You understand filing systems?" Alexandra asked, examining Rose's work. "Yes, ma'am. I worked as an administrative assistant through college," Rose replied honestly. Alexandra's eyebrows rose with interest. "Yet you didn't mention this in your interview." "I wanted to earn my place here based on the job I applied for," Rose explained, meeting Alexandra's gaze steadily. A small smile played at Alexandra's lips. "Interesting. Would you mind helping me organize some charity event proposals?" As they worked together, Alexandra discovered Rose's sharp business mind and practical insights. What started as a simple filing task turned into an impromptu brainstorming session for the upcoming charity gala. However, their collaborative moment was interrupted by Mrs. Chen bursting in. "Ms. Thompson, there's been a complaint about certain staff members overstepping their boundaries." The pointed look she gave Rose spoke volumes. Alexandra's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Chen, Rose is here at my request. In fact, her suggestions for the gala are quite valuable." That evening, as Rose headed home, she heard quick footsteps behind her. It was Mr. Richardson, Alexandra's brother. "Rose, wait," he called out. "I wanted to thank you for helping with those international client files yesterday. Your translation notes were extremely helpful." Rose smiled politely, trying to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. She'd noticed him watching her lately, but surely someone of his status wouldn't. "Would you consider taking on some additional responsibilities? With fair compensation, of course," he added quickly. Before Rose could respond, a car pulled up and several of Mr. Richardson's friends emerged. Their expressions changed from friendly to cold when they saw him talking to a maid. "James, darling, what are you doing out here?" one woman asked, her tone dripping with disdain. Rose quickly excused herself, feeling their judging eyes on her back. As she walked home, she wondered if she was fighting a losing battle. But then she remembered her mother's words. "Your worth isn't determined by their perception of you." That night, as Rose helped her younger sister with homework, she realized something important. Every whisper, every slight, every challenge was making her stronger. She was changing the dynamics of the Richardson household, not through confrontation, but through quiet excellence. Little did she know, both Alexandra and her brother had noticed much more than she realized. Changes were coming to the Richardson estate, and Rose would be at the center of them all, whether Mrs. Chen and her allies liked it or not. The next morning, Rose returned to work with renewed determination. Let them whisper. She had a job to do, and she would do it exceptionally well. After all, the best revenge against prejudice is success, and Rose was just getting started. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine marble floors of the Richardson mansion as a young woman in a simple navy blazer and pencil skirt waited nervously in the grand foyer. Her name was Rose, and her hands were clasped tightly in her lap as she sat straight-backed on the antique settee, fighting the urge to fidget with her carefully pressed collar. This wasn't just another job interview for her. After putting herself through college, working multiple jobs, and caring for her younger siblings, Rose knew this position could change everything. The Richardson family was among the wealthiest in the city, and their household staff received not only excellent pay but full benefits, something she desperately needed to help with her mother's medical bills. As she waited, Rose couldn't help but notice how the other staff members kept casting sideways glances at her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, had barely concealed her disapproval when checking Rose's references, despite her stellar recommendations from previous employers. Rose took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had earned her place here just like anyone else. "Miss Thompson will see you now," announced the butler, his tone clipped and formal. Rose followed him through winding corridors lined with priceless artwork until they reached an elegant study. Behind a massive mahogany desk sat Alexandra Thompson, the estate's owner. Her sharp eyes studied Rose with unexpected intensity. "Your qualifications are impressive," Alexandra began, reviewing Rose's resume. "Graduated with honors while working full-time, fluent in 3 languages, exceptional references. Tell me, why apply for a housekeeping position?" Rose met her gaze steadily. "I believe in starting from the ground up, Ms. Thompson. I want to understand every aspect of running a successful household. And frankly, I need stable employment with health benefits to help support my family. Something flickered in Alexandra's expression. Respect, perhaps. She leaned forward slightly. Honesty. Refreshing. Most candidates try to impress me with flattery. The interview continued, with Alexandra asking increasingly complex questions about household management, cultural etiquette, and crisis handling. Rose answered each one thoughtfully, drawing from her real-world experience rather than textbook responses. As they wrapped up, Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, clearly expecting Rose to be dismissed. Instead, Alexandra stood and extended her hand. "When can you start?" "Tomorrow, if you'd like," Rose replied, trying to contain her excitement. "Excellent. Mrs. Chen will show you around and handle the paperwork." Alexandra's lips curved into a slight smile. "I have a feeling you're going to shake things up around here, Ms. Rose, in the best possible way." As Rose followed Mrs. Chen out, she caught a glimpse of Alexandra watching her thoughtfully. Little did either woman know that this moment would mark the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about class, love, and what truly matters in life. That evening, as Rose shared the good news with her family over their modest dinner, she felt hope blooming in her chest. Yes, there would be challenges ahead. She could already sense the resistance from some staff members. But she had overcome obstacles her entire life. This was just another mountain to climb, and she was ready for the journey. What she couldn't have known was that her presence would soon turn the Richardson household upside down, challenging long-held prejudices and opening hearts in unexpected ways. But that's how the best stories often begin, with one person brave enough to step through a door, even when others would prefer it remained closed.